Every summer, golfers walk past a wall of cut stone at the edge of a New York park, never asking what it held. The stone belonged to a warehouse built to store 80,000 tons of ice. In 1926, a demolition crew set it on fire by accident, and locals swear it smoldered for over a year. That warehouse powered a $60 million monopoly, controlling the one thing keeping a city's milk, meat, and medicine from spoiling. The man who built it triggered a national banking collapse, faked a fatal disease inside federal prison, and died quietly at home decades later. Rewind past that fire, past the golf course, past the ruins, and you land on a 256-acre spring-fed lake at the foot of Hook Mountain. Water so pure that people started calling it the Ice House of New York City. That nickname came from Rockland Lake itself, not from any company. And the man who actually deserves the title Ice King isn't the one this story is really about. That honor belongs to Frederick Tudor, a Boston merchant who in the early 1800s packed ice in sawdust and shipped it as far as the Caribbean and Brazil, proving frozen water could survive a tropical crossing if you were clever enough about insulation. Tudor built an entire industry out of nothing. What came after him built a monopoly out of Tudor's blueprint, and did it with bribery instead of ingenuity. Within a few decades, ice had gone from an eccentric New England export to something Americans in every major city assumed would simply always be there when summer arrived, an assumption the next generation of icemen would learn exactly how to exploit. By the 1850s, the Knickerbocker Ice Company had turned that lake into an industrial machine, employing around 3,000 people, running a dozen steamboats and 75 barges up and down the Hudson. Every winter, once the ice reached 12 to 15 inches thick, workers cut a grid into it with horse-drawn plows, then hand-sawed it into blocks, roughly 22 by 32 by 12 inches, about 160 pounds each, and dragged them toward ice houses that measured over 350 feet long, 100 feet wide, and 50 feet high. Double walls packed with sawdust let a single ice house hold 50 to 80,000 tons at once, preserving most of a winter's harvest clear through August. A gravity railroad, built in 1858, hauled the loaded cars roughly 1,000 feet down the mountainside toward the Hudson without any engine at all. Some accounts put the drop at around 150 feet, others closer to 280, but either way, horses pulled the empty cars back up, and gravity did the rest coming down. No steam, no coal, just elevation and animal labor, moving a luxury item like a controlled waterfall. At the bottom of the chute, powerful mechanical brakes had to stop each loaded car before it slammed into the loading dock, because gravity, once you let it start pulling several tons of ice down a mountainside, does not particularly care whether anyone remembered to plan for the stop. New York needed every ton of it. The city was burning through 3 to 4 million tons of ice a year by 1900 because ice wasn't a luxury there. It was the only thing standing between a family's food, milk, or medicine and the summer heat. An entire seasonal economy grew up around that need. Farmers from up to 10 miles off the lake showed up every January for harvest wages, and once the season ended, some of them walked straight into local quarry work until the next freeze. Around the lake itself, hotels and bungalows started filling in between the ice houses, guests dancing at dinner within sight of the machinery that fed a city 60 miles south. The man who would eventually take this operation and turn it into something closer to extortion grew up 90 miles north on the Kennebec River in Bath, Maine. Charles Wyman Morse was born there in 1856, the son of Benjamin Wyman Morse, whose own firm ran ships, tugboats, and ice on the Kennebec. As a boy, Charles survived a bout of infantile paralysis that left him with a permanent limp. He'd spend the rest of his life leaning on a cane and wearing a distinctive top hat. A small man who made himself impossible to overlook in a room. At Bowdoin College, in a class that included a young Robert Peary, his father offered him $1,500 a year to keep the books for the family's towing company. Morse quietly hired someone else to do the actual work for $500, pocketed the difference, and used it to help pay his own way through school. That isn't a story about a resourceful young man. That is the entire rest of his career, already fully formed 20 years early. The opening he needed arrived in the warm winter of 1889 into 1890, one of the mildest on record. Ice on the Hudson barely formed thick enough to cut. The Knickerbocker Ice Company, unable to harvest what its contracts required, had to import blocks from as far away as Maine just to keep customers supplied. Newspapers were calling it an ice famine. For most of the industry, it looked like a disaster. For Charles Morse, running his own small ice and lumber shipping firm out of Bath, it looked like an opening. By 1891, a financially wounded Knickerbocker let him buy his way inside the very company that had defined the lake for 40 years. The exact weakness that nearly wrecked the natural ice trade, total dependence on a cold winter, is what put Morse in control of it. Nobody noticed yet that the same weakness would eventually finish off the entire industry. It would just take 30 more years, and one invention nobody at Rockland Lake could stop. By then, Morse wasn't harvesting ice so much as harvesting other people's bad seasons. He understood something the old Hudson River ice barons never had to learn. You didn't need to control the weather. You just needed enough capital to survive a bad one better than your competitors did, and enough patience to wait for the next warm winter to hand you somebody else's company. Between 1891 and 1897, Morse ran the same play over and over. During slow, cool summers, when smaller ice companies were desperate for cash, he'd extend them loans. When they couldn't repay on schedule, he took stock instead of cash and quietly became their owner. Along the way, he folded in operators like the Diamond Ice Company and a string of smaller Hudson dealers, absorbing each one as debt came due. By 1897, he had formalized the whole operation under a new name, the Consolidated Ice Company, which by then controlled most of what came down the Hudson and much of what shipped south from Maine. He hadn't out-innovated a single competitor. He had simply outweighted them, one bad season at a time. The real leap came in 1899, when Consolidated Ice merged with the old Knickerbocker Ice Company and a string of smaller operators to form something new, the American Ice Company, incorporated in New Jersey, with Morse installed as president. The paperwork alone should have raised alarms. The new corporation was capitalized at $60 million, a figure contemporaries openly called watered, grossly inflated beyond what the actual ice, barges, and ice houses were worth on any honest ledger. A company selling frozen water was now, on paper, worth more than most American cities. Newspapers started calling Morse the Ice King, and this time the nickname wasn't a compliment. Within a year, by some contemporary estimates, his company supplied something close to 90% of the retail ice sold in New York City. Owning the ice wasn't even the important part. Owning the docks was. Through Tammany Hall connections, American Ice secured exclusive rights to key waterfront unloading points around Manhattan, meaning a rival company could have the purest ice on the eastern seaboard and still have nowhere to bring it ashore. The monopoly wasn't built on a better product. It was built on physically locking out anyone who tried to compete, one pier at a time. Inside the city, the machine ran on human labor most customers never thought about. By some period estimates, the New York ice trade at its height involved close to 90,000 people and 25,000 horses, a figure worth treating with some caution, but even conservatively, an army of labor moved invisibly through the ordinary rhythm of a New York summer. Roughly 500 wagons and 1,000 delivery men crossed the city every day, keeping households supplied with a commodity that had to be replaced every few days once real heat set in. Families stored their allotment in insulated wooden ice boxes, and it was almost always the children who were sent out to buy the smallest, cheapest chunks the corner dealer had left over. That detail matters, because those exact sizes were about to disappear from the price list entirely. One man in the city had already understood what was really at stake. Nathan Strauss, co-owner of Macy's, had spent years watching infant mortality spike in the tenements every summer, and he traced a direct line back to unsafe milk that spoiled without proper cooling. In 1893, he opened New York's first pasteurized milk depot at the 3rd Street Recreation Pier on the East River, backed by his own laboratory on Avenue C to test what he sold. He priced clean milk at as little as a penny a glass and covered the cost himself for families who couldn't pay even that. Strauss wasn't fighting American ice directly. He was quietly repairing, out of his own pocket, the exact damage a frozen water monopoly was about to make dramatically worse. That damage arrived in the spring of 1900. American ice sharply raised its prices. Contemporary accounts differ on the precise figures, describing increases from roughly 25 to 50 cents per 100 pounds, or by other tellings, from 30 to 60, or in still another version, from $5.50 to over $13 a ton. But nearly every account agrees the price essentially doubled inside a single season. At the same time, the company quietly stopped selling its smallest, cheapest cuts of ice altogether. That wasn't a shortage, that was a decision, and it landed hardest on the customers with the least room to absorb it. The company blamed a natural ice famine, pointing to a lighter-than-usual Hudson harvest. Its own trade publications backed up the story. Independent papers didn't buy it, and one New York Times article that May warned that resentment against the trust exists under every roof, describing a company that had all but cornered the city's ice supply. Philadelphia newspapers noticed, too, running headlines pointedly announcing that their own ice dealers would not be following New York's example. A small, humiliating detail that made clear the price hike wasn't a natural response to weather at all, since the same winter had apparently spared every other eastern city's supply. William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal turned the story into a daily front-page fight, accusing Tammany Hall of profiting directly from a monopoly over something as basic as frozen water. For weeks, it stayed a war of accusations, dockets, and denials. Then, in June 1900, it stopped being one. The American Ice Company stockholder list became public, and there among the names was Robert Anderson Van Wyck, the first mayor of the newly consolidated Greater New York, a man earning $15,000 a year in salary, holding stock in the company worth somewhere around $680,000, by most tallies split between roughly 2,660 preferred shares and 3,325 common. Tammany boss Richard Croker's name was on the list, too, alongside his deputy, John F. Carroll. The mayor of New York, it turned out, had a very direct financial stake in the price of ice going up. The state moved quickly, at least on paper. On May 28, 1900, attorney Meyer Nussbaum was appointed as an official referee to take sworn testimony on American Ice's business, as authorities weighed whether the trust could legally be broken apart. Governor Theodore Roosevelt ordered a separate state investigation into the mayor's conduct. Reporters and subpoenas circled the company for the rest of the year, and Croker, sensing the ground shifting under Tammany, let his own deputy, Carroll, take the public fall rather than risk his own position. It was a familiar move inside a political machine built on loyalty running in exactly one direction, upward, toward the boss, never back down toward the men who did the boss's riskier favors. Morse didn't wait to see how any of it turned out. While the referee took testimony and the papers kept printing, he quietly sold his position and stepped back from the ice business entirely, walking away with an estimated $12 million in profit. He wasn't punished. He wasn't even seriously investigated. He simply left before the bill came due, a habit he was about to repeat on a far larger stage, with far more money and far more damage attached to his name. The way Van Wyck got that stock wasn't incidental either. According to the evidence that came out during the investigation, Morse had personally helped arrange for the mayor to acquire the shares at a favorable price, and had helped finance the purchase. Not a gift exactly, but not an arm's-length transaction between strangers either. It was the kind of favor that only makes sense between a monopolist who needs friends in city government and a mayor who controls which companies get access to municipal waterfront. And for a while, the arrangement actually worked, the way monopolies always promise they will. Deliveries were more reliable than they'd been under a fragmented patchwork of competing dealers. Prices, before 1900, had stayed relatively stable for years at a time. The docks ran on a predictable schedule instead of a chaotic scramble between rival barge crews fighting over the same berths. American ice had, in a narrow sense, solved a real logistical problem the old competitive ice trade never had a clean answer for. That was precisely what made the 1900 price hike feel like such a betrayal. The company wasn't failing to deliver on its promise of order. It was simply proving that the order had only ever existed for its own convenience and could be switched off the moment it was profitable to do so. Up at Rockland Lake itself, the daily grind of the industry barely paused for any of it. The harvest still ran every January into March. The same grid still got cut into the ice. The same gravity chute still rattled loaded cars down toward the river. In 1907, the workforce even broke a decades-old pattern when Josephine Hudson became documented as the lake's first woman ice harvester, working alongside crews that had been entirely male since 1831. It was a strange kind of normalcy. A scandal was tearing through New York City politics over the price of what these workers were cutting, while the physical labor of cutting it barely changed at all. There was one detail buried inside the 1899 merger that almost nobody noticed at the time. American ice hadn't just absorbed natural ice harvesters like Knickerbocker. It had also quietly folded in a handful of small chemical ice plants in Brooklyn and Manhattan, businesses using ammonia gas to freeze water mechanically, with no lake, no winter, and no gravity railroad required. Morse wasn't betting the company's entire future on natural ice. He was hedging, buying a small foothold in the technology that would eventually make Rockland Lake obsolete, even while his fortune still depended on the old system staying dominant a little longer. For the tenement families actually living through the summer of 1900, none of that mechanical foresight mattered. What mattered was a delivery man telling a mother on a fifth-floor landing that the smallest block was no longer available, that the price had gone up again, and that there was no other company to call. A household that had budgeted for ice the same way it budgeted for rent now had to choose which bill got shorted first. Multiply that decision across a few 100,000 tenement apartments in a summer where the temperature climbed and the milk turned before dinner, and the outrage stops being abstract. It becomes a specific, physical, daily math problem that a monopoly had just made significantly worse on purpose. Coverage like that kept running all spring, describing a business that had effectively doubled New Yorkers' cost of staying fed and healthy through the summer, in language sharp enough that even Tammany's allies in the press had trouble spinning it. Nathan Strauss, watching all of this from his milk depots, understood exactly what was coming. Warmer weather without affordable ice meant more spoiled milk, and more spoiled milk meant more sick children. His depots couldn't scale fast enough to replace what a citywide ice shortage would cost in raw human terms. But they were the only real safety net anyone in New York had built before the crisis hit. By the time Meyer Nussbaum's referee hearings opened that summer, the company had already banked its windfall from the price increase for months. Testimony dragged through the fall. Newspapers kept a running tally of which Tammany figures had stock and how much. And the entire time, the man who had built the mechanism at the center of it all was already negotiating his exit, watching the scandal consume men who had merely benefited from his system, while he had been the one who designed it. That exit is the detail worth sitting with before the story moves on. A $60 million company had been built on watered stock, secured through political bribery, and used to double the price of a survival good during a heat wave. And the man who engineered every part of it walked away clean, $12 million richer, before a single referee finished asking a single question. The people left holding the wreckage weren't the architect. They were the mayor who took a stock tip, the machine boss who took the political risk, and a city full of families who never had a say in any of it. When Governor Roosevelt's investigation finally concluded, it formally cleared Van Wyck of direct wrongdoing. On paper, he had done nothing illegal. In practice, it didn't matter. The New York Times would later sum up his term as an administration mired in what one retrospective called black mud and slime. The exact wording varies slightly between later retellings, but the verdict was unanimous. Being found innocent and being politically finished turned out to be two entirely different outcomes. Croker's Tammany machine lost its grip on City Hall in the 1901 election to reform candidate Seth Low, and Croker himself, watching his own deputy Carroll take the public blame he might have deserved personally, chose to retire from Tammany leadership rather than fight for it. Van Wyck didn't stay to watch any of it unfold from the sidelines. A lifelong bachelor, he suddenly married, and the day after leaving office, he boarded a ship for Paris, reportedly carrying close to $5 million, a figure that comes from a single popular account and should be treated with caution. But even a fraction of that sum would have made him one of the wealthier private citizens in France. He lived there for the rest of his life and died in 1918, his body brought home only for burial in the Bronx. New York would eventually attach his name to something else entirely, but that part of the story comes later. Morse, meanwhile, had already moved on to something much bigger than frozen water. He poured his ice fortune into coastal steamships, eventually consolidating more than 100 vessels into the Metropolitan Steamship Company, a merger later valued at roughly $120 million. From there, he moved into banking outright, and by the peak of his career, he directly controlled or sat on the boards of more than a dozen banks. It was the exact same method that had built American ice: buy in, consolidate, leverage the resulting scale into more control, just aimed at an entirely different industry, with an entirely different set of victims waiting on the other end of it. In New York's financial district, Morse found a partner who thought in exactly the same terms he did. F. Augustus Heinz had made a fortune off Montana copper mines before arriving in New York in 1906 with a reported $12 million, looking for a foothold in high finance. Together, Morse and Heinz ended up with partial control of at least 6 national banks, 10 state banks, 5 trust companies, and 4 insurance companies, an enormous pool of deposit money sitting in accounts belonging to ordinary Americans who had no idea 2 speculators were quietly deciding how to use it. Heinz had made his own fortune by exploiting a quirk in Montana mining law that let a claim owner follow a copper vein wherever it led, even underneath a neighbor's property. And he had used that loophole to bully larger operators until they simply bought him out. He arrived in New York already a millionaire, and within months, a bank president. In October 1907, Heinz's brother Otto decided to use some of that money to corner the stock of United Copper, believing the family already controlled enough shares to force short sellers into a panic buyback. On October 14th, the plan launched, and United Copper's price jumped from around $39 to nearly $60 in a single session. Within 2 days, the scheme collapsed completely, the stock crashing back toward $10 and taking Otto's brokerage firm down with it. Depositors who'd heard the Heinz name attached to the disaster started pulling cash out of every bank connected to him, and then, within days, out of every bank connected to Morse as well. By October 21st, the panic had reached the Knickerbocker Trust Company, whose president, Charles T. Barney, was a known financier of Morse's schemes. Knickerbocker failed within a day of the run reaching its doors, and what had started as one failed stock squeeze in Montana copper turned into the panic of 1907, a crisis serious enough that it helped push Congress 6 years later to create the Federal Reserve System. It took the private intervention of financier J.P. Morgan, personally coordinating a rescue fund among the city's surviving banks to keep the panic from spreading even further than it already had. Heinz himself was indicted alongside Morse for the scheme, but where the courts convicted the more calculating of the 2 men, They eventually exonerated the more reckless one entirely. Heinze went back to Montana broke, but still regarded there as something of a folk hero for his earlier fights against the bigger mining trusts. Morse didn't walk away clean this time. United States Attorney Henry L. Stimson indicted him for misappropriating bank funds, secured a conviction, and in November 1908, a federal judge sentenced him to 15 years at the penitentiary in Atlanta. Morse stayed free on appeal for over a year before finally entering the prison on January 2, 1910, where, by coincidence, one of his fellow inmates was a young con man named Charles Ponzi, years before that name meant anything to anyone. Morse's family and legal team went to work immediately. Political fixer Harry Doherty and journalist allies like Clarence Barron lobbied President Taft directly for a pardon. And in December 1909, the entire city of Bath sent Taft a telegram pleading for Morse's release, signed by the sitting mayor, 6 former mayors, and a slate of Maine legislators. Taft refused repeatedly. So Morse changed tactics. While Army doctors monitored him in custody, he secretly drank a mixture of soapsuds and chemicals designed to mimic the internal bleeding symptoms of fatal kidney disease. The doctors, fooled, declared his condition incurable and progressive. On January 18, 1912, Taft signed the order commuting his sentence, believing he was letting a dying man go home to pass away in peace. Morse sailed for a spa in Germany to take the waters. Within months, he came back to Bath, Maine, looking entirely healthy, to a hero's welcome from the same town that had begged for his release. It would later come out, through subsequent Justice Department scrutiny, that the entire illness had been staged, and the same Harry Doherty who had helped engineer that fraudulent pardon went on, within a decade, to become the Attorney General of the United States, the nation's top law enforcement officer, a job he took a few years after helping fake a federal prisoner's death sentence to get him released early. Morse never really stopped. During the First World War, with fresh capital and the same old instincts, he formed the United Steamship Company, secured emergency federal shipbuilding funds, and promised the government 36 freighters for the war effort. He delivered 22, only 2 of them the wooden vessels he'd contracted for, and none of the steel ones, using a healthy portion of the government's money to expand his own shipyards instead. He was indicted again, this time for war profiteering and mail fraud, but the prosecution's momentum collapsed alongside Harry Doherty's own reputation, once Doherty's fixer-for-hire passed. The same pattern that had freed Morse a decade earlier became a national scandal in its own right during the Harding administration. The charges lost steam. Morse walked again. While all of this played out in courtrooms and steamship ledgers, the industry that had made him rich in the first place was already quietly dying back at Rockland Lake, undone by the exact vulnerability that had once made Morse's fortune possible. Mechanical refrigeration didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in small, ammonia-cooled plants, the same kind Morse had quietly folded into his company back in 1899. And it kept improving year after year until it no longer made sense to cut, haul, insulate, and ship a product you could now manufacture on-site in any city block in any season, regardless of what the weather did that winter. Natural ice harvesting at Rockland Lake finally ceased in 1924. The gravity chute went silent. The barges stopped running. For 2 more years, the empty ice houses just stood there on the shore, waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. In 1926, a demolition crew moving in to finally clear the site accidentally set the old structures on fire. The same sawdust insulation that had once kept a summer's worth of ice from melting now did the opposite job with brutal efficiency, feeding a blaze that tore through walls 50 feet high. Local accounts, passed down since, claim pockets of that fire kept smoldering underground for over a year afterward, a detail that's impossible to fully verify, but one that every local telling of this story insists on repeating. When it finally burned itself out completely, All that remained standing were the massive stone foundation walls at the water's edge. Everything wooden, everything that had ever moved or held or insulated anything, was gone. The land sat mostly untouched for 3 decades. In 1958, the Palisades Interstate Park Commission began buying up the old parcels, and by 1965, Rockland Lake State Park had opened its gates to the public. Today, there are 2 golf courses, a public pool, tennis courts, and a swimming beach, all built around a lake that once employed 3,000 people and fed a monopoly worth $60 million. Families picnic within sight of the stone ruins without ever being told what they're looking at. The lake's clean spring water, the same quality that once made it the most valuable ice source on the eastern seaboard, is now just the reason the swimming is pleasant. The company's name outlived the lake by decades, just in a different form. American Ice kept building manufactured ice plants long after natural harvesting stopped making sense, including one in Baltimore in 1911, a red brick 21-bay factory on West Franklin Street with its own powerhouse backed right up against the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks, shipping ice as far as New York and Washington. A second American ice plant in Baltimore, built in 1905 and expanded in 1919, went up as an almost windowless structure the height of a 6-story building, designed with no interest in letting light or heat anywhere near what it stored. It ran for nearly a century, until fires in 2001 and 2004 gutted it so badly the plant finally closed for good. The building sat empty and fire-scarred for years afterward, until it was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2013 and purchased in 2016 by a developer named Ilya Alter for $540,000. Alter, who had immigrated from Russia in 1992 and considered Baltimore his American hometown, announced an $18 million plan to turn the old ice plant into a concert venue, a restaurant, an artist incubator, and 40 residential units, backed by millions in state historic tax credits. That redevelopment never happened. As of the most recent available reporting, the property remains empty, still being shopped around by real estate firms for lease, auction, or sale. A preservation success story that exists so far only on paper. In the same way, the American Ice Company's original $60 million valuation once existed only on paper. Even the hopeful chapter of this story hasn't actually arrived yet. Charles Morse never faced anything like that kind of unresolved waiting. He died on January 12, 1933, in Bath, Maine, at 76 years old, of complications from pneumonia. Not in a cell, not in disgrace, not in exile, but quietly at home, in the same town that had once sent a telegram to a sitting president begging for his freedom. He was buried in Oak Grove Cemetery. Decades earlier, in 1904, he had donated $75,000 to build Bath's high school. That building burned down in 1928 and was rebuilt, and it still carries his name today, Morse High School, a public school named for a man who built a monopoly on frozen water, triggered a national banking panic, faked a fatal disease to escape federal prison, and was indicted a 3rd time for defrauding his own government during a world war. Robert Van Wyck got a different kind of monument, and it's the one worth ending on. Decades after his death, New York City built a highway through Queens and named it after him, the Van Wyck Expressway, a road now infamous among New Yorkers for exactly one thing: it almost never moves. Local traffic reports mention it almost daily, one of the most reliably gridlocked stretches of pavement anywhere in the country. Drivers sit in it for hours trying to reach JFK Airport, cursing a name most of them have no reason to recognize, attached to a stretch of road that has become a permanent physical punchline about things in New York that promise speed and deliver a standstill instead. The golfers at Rockland Lake still walk past that same wall of stone every summer. Most of them still don't know what it once held, or what kind of fire it took to leave only the foundation standing. The ice is long gone. The company is gone. The men who built the whole machine got old, got pardoned, got rich, or got buried with their names still intact. What's left is exactly what usually survives a story like this one. Not the guilty men, but the walls. Every so often, groundskeepers at the park still find blackened chunks of stone or old iron fittings buried near the tree line, small leftover pieces of a machine that once decided whether a child's milk made it through July.